The year was 1888, and the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company was running out of time. Outside, winter pressed against the factory town of Plymouth, Michigan, rattling windows and hardening the ground. Inside the company's boardroom, the cold felt heavier. It lingered in the air, mixed with the stale residue of cigar smoke and the dry metallic dust that clung to everything in a building devoted to iron. The room was functional, not elegant. A heavy oak table dominated the center. Around it sat men who were not dreamers, not toy makers, not merchants of novelty. They were industrialists, grim-faced, practical, and increasingly afraid. They had built their fortunes on windmills, not decorative ones, but massive structures of cast iron and steel, engineered to pump water from the earth for America's farmers. These machines were marvels of durability. Once planted in the soil, they could stand for decades, even a century. They were efficient. They were indestructible. They were also killing the company. The problem was not demand. Farmers needed water. The problem was physics. Cast iron was heavy, unforgivingly so. Transporting these towering machines from the foundry in Plymouth to the wide plains of the Midwest had become a logistical nightmare. Rail costs were relentless. Wagon transport was slow and expensive. Every mile erased profit. Every sale barely covered its own delivery. On the table lay the proof, the ledger. Its pages were marked with red ink, bleeding line after line. Losses stacked where margins were supposed to be. The numbers did not argue. They accused. There were 25 shareholders in that room, men who had pooled their money to build the factory, to bet on American agriculture and industrial progress. Now they faced the real possibility that the entire venture would collapse. Warehouses were full of unsold iron. The yard outside held windmills that no longer moved, not because the wind had stopped, but because buyers could not justify the cost of getting them home. This was not a story of bad management or poor craftsmanship. The machines were too good. Built to last, they eliminated repeat business. Built of iron, they punished anyone who tried to move them. The company had engineered itself into a corner. The mood in the room reflected that reality. Conversation was sparse, cautious. No one had a solution. They were not looking for growth anymore. They were looking for survival, for something, anything that could interrupt the slow march toward insolvency. And then the door opened. A man entered who did not belong to this world of towering blades and water pumps. His name was Clarence Hamilton. He was a watchmaker by trade, an inventor by instinct. He worked with gears and springs, with precision rather than mass. He was not there to discuss agriculture or shipping routes. He carried a bundle wrapped tightly in oilcloth. Without ceremony, Hamilton moved to the table. The men watched him in silence. He did not speak. He did not pitch. He placed the bundle down among the ledgers and cigar stubs, the object landing softly, almost out of place in a room built for iron and failure. For the first time that day, the room leaned forward. Hamilton's hands went to the cloth, and before a single word was spoken, before any explanation was offered, something unfamiliar entered the boardroom, the quiet tension of an interruption, the kind that only comes just before something changes. Clarence Hamilton did not introduce himself. He stood at the table and finished unwrapping the oilcloth, folding it back carefully, deliberately, as if what he was revealing required no justification. Beneath the cloth sat a strange skeletal device, metal tubing, exposed mechanisms, and a crude wooden stock. It was recognizably a gun, but unlike anything the men in the room had seen before. In 1888, air guns existed, but they were curiosities. Expensive, delicate, built for parlors and wealthy hobbyists. Fragile machines meant to impress, not endure. What lay on the table was different. This thing looked industrial. It was mostly metal, simple, stripped of ornament, designed to be made cheaply and made many times. Hamilton was a watchmaker by trade, a man accustomed to springs, gears, and tension. He did not explain how the mechanism worked. He did not list materials or costs. He picked the device up. Without asking permission, he walked to the corner of the boardroom. There, against the wall, sat a wire wastebasket filled with crumpled paper, discarded notes, calculations, the physical remnants of a failing business. The men around the table watched in silence. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Hamilton cocked the lever. The sound of the mechanism was unfamiliar in that room, not the groan of iron or the scrape of ledgers, but the tight resistance of a spring being compressed. He raised the barrel and aimed it at the basket. Then he pulled the trigger. Thwack! The sound cut through the room, sharp, distinct, final. A small lead ball tore through the paper and struck the wire frame, rattling with a force that did not belong to a toy. The basket shuddered. The echo hung in the air longer than the noise itself. No one moved. That sound did something the ledger never could. It announced power, contained, controlled, and unmistakable. It was the sound of energy released with purpose. One of the men stood. Louis Cass Hoff, the company's general manager, was not given to theatrics. He was practical. He understood machinery. He crossed the room, picked up the gun, and felt its weight. It balanced cleanly in his hand. He cocked it himself, feeling the tension build, the mechanism engaging exactly as it was meant to. He fired again. Thwack! Hoff turned back toward the table. His expression had changed. Not joy, not surprise, but recognition. He had seen something rare, a machine that worked and worked well. He looked at Hamilton and spoke without thinking. Boy, that's a daisy. In the slang of the time, a daisy meant the best of its kind, a superlative, a compliment reserved for something exceptional. Hoff was not naming a toy. He was reacting to a machine. But in that moment, he did more than approve an invention. He named what would replace the windmill. The board did not pivot overnight. For all its impact, the sound of the shot did not immediately erase decades of habit. The men around the table were still windmill manufacturers. They understood towers, gears, and agricultural contracts. They did not understand toys, and they did not trust novelty. What Clarence Hamilton had brought into the room felt powerful, but it also felt unfamiliar, something adjacent to their business, not a replacement for it. They were desperate, but not reckless. So they did what industrial men often do when faced with something they don't fully understand. They used it as leverage. The decision was practical, almost conservative. The company would continue selling its iron windmills. The air rifle would not be the product. It would be the incentive, a sweetener. If a farmer agreed to purchase a Plymouth iron windmill, the company would include one of the new rifles at no additional cost, a premium to close the deal. The logic was simple. The farmer needed water. The windmill served the farm. The rifle could be taken home, used to scare crows, deal with rats, or handed down to a son, a useful extra, nothing more. The salesmen were sent out across the rural counties, pitching iron towers as they always had. Weeks passed. Then they began to return. Their reports were strange. Yes, farmers were listening. Yes, they were interested. But the conversations were no longer centered on blade efficiency or pumping capacity. The questions kept drifting away from the windmill toward the rifle. How much for the gun? Could they get another one? Could they buy just the rifle? Some farmers made their position clear. They were willing to walk away from the windmill entirely if the rifle wasn't included. Others asked directly whether the gun could be purchased on its own, without the iron tower that came with it. The pattern was consistent enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The bribe had eclipsed the deal. The rifle, light, compact, inexpensive to manufacture, was generating more interest than the towering machines that had defined the company for decades. A few pounds of steel tubing and a spring were outperforming tons of cast iron in the marketplace. Inside the boardroom, the realization settled slowly. What they had assumed was an accessory was behaving like a product. What they believed to be the core business was becoming the obstacle. The company still thought of itself as a windmill manufacturer, but the farmers had already made a different decision. They were not buying water pumps anymore. They were asking for the gun. And with every report that came back, the gap between what the board believed and what the market wanted grew wider until it could no longer be ignored. By 1895, the board no longer needed convincing. The reports from the field had stripped away doubt. Farmers were not reacting to marketing. They were responding to something more basic, an object that felt useful, powerful, and attainable. The windmill, for all its engineering, had become a burden. The rifle had become the reason people showed up at all. The decision that followed was not framed as an experiment. It was not hedged or delayed. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company did not attempt to balance two identities or hedge its future. It did something far more dangerous. It stopped. The casting of massive iron blades ceased. The assembly of towering agricultural structures ended. The yards that had once held rows of unfinished windmills went quiet. Inside the factory, furnaces that had been built to melt iron for water pumping machines were reassigned to a different purpose. The factory was retooled. This was not an evolution. It was a mutation. Heavy industry does not pivot easily. The machines inside the Plymouth plant were designed for scale, pressure, and permanence. They were not delicate. They were not refined. And when they were turned toward a new product, they did not suddenly become gentle. The blast furnaces that had once fed iron into windmill molds were now used to melt lead. Where agricultural hardware had been produced, ammunition began to take shape. The same industrial mindset, the same tolerance for heat, weight, and force, was applied to something smaller but no less serious. The guns that came out of this factory were not built like toys. They were stamped from heavy-gauge steel, assembled by machinists accustomed to building equipment meant to survive decades in open fields. The stocks were made of real wood. The mechanisms were simple, robust, and unapologetically mechanical. When you held one of these early rifles, you were holding a piece of industrial equipment that had been reduced in size, not in tension. In January of 1895, the board formalized what had already happened on the factory floor. The word windmill was dropped from the company's name. It would never appear again. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company officially became the Daisy Manufacturing Company. The name change marked more than a shift in product. It marked a break in identity. Companies typically refine what they already are. They iterate, adjust, modernize. Daisy did none of that. It abandoned its original purpose entirely. A firm that had once existed to serve agriculture transformed overnight into a manufacturer of objects meant for the hands of children. But because it was born in iron, it never truly softened. The men running the factory did not think in terms of play. They thought in terms of function, durability, and consequence. The rifles reflected that worldview. They had sharp edges. They had weight. Their triggers required effort. They smelled of machine oil, not paint or glue. This accidental origin would shape everything that followed. Daisy did not set out to build fantasies. It built machines, and in doing so, it created something far more powerful than it understood. A tool that carried the full weight of American industry into backyards, barns, and empty lots. The pivot was complete. There was no transition period, no overlap between past and future. The windmill was gone, left behind to rust in the scrap heap of industrial history. What remained was a factory that had learned too late and too suddenly that it was far better at making steel sing than it ever was at chasing the wind. By the time Daisy had fully shed its windmill past, a new generation had taken control of the company. At its head was the grandson of Louis Cass Hoff, the man whose offhand remark had named the rifle years earlier. The grandfather had been a Victorian industrialist, shaped by the 19th century. The grandson belonged to the 20th. He was an aviator, a risk-taker, a man who believed in motion and force. He did not see danger as something to be eliminated. He saw it as something to be confronted. Under his leadership, Daisy's worldview hardened. He looked at the boys of America and did not see fragile innocence in need of protection. He saw unfinished men, future soldiers, future leaders. In his mind, you could not shape character through softness. You forged it, and forging required pressure. A gun to him was not primarily a weapon. It was a tool of discipline. It demanded focus. It required patience. It punished carelessness. If a boy missed the target, he failed. If he mishandled the rifle and hurt himself, it hurt. That pain was not a defect in the system. It was the system working as intended. A lesson delivered immediately and without abstraction. Daisy did not build its rifles to remove that experience. They were not designed to be forgiving. They were built with weight and resistance, triggers that required deliberate force, levers that demanded strength. The design communicated a message without words. This object is not to be treated casually. Safety, as Daisy understood it, was not about eliminating risk. It was about respect, muzzle awareness, backstop discipline, control, responsibility. The assumption was simple and absolute. A boy was capable of learning these things. The rifles reflected that belief. They were not softened for small hands beyond what was necessary. They were not disguised as toys. They smelled of oil and steel. They felt cold at first too. They carried consequences. This philosophy did not need to be explained to the customer. It was embedded in the object itself. A child understood it the moment he tried to cock the lever and felt the resistance push back. But ideology alone does not carry culture. Daisy had the factory. It had the worldview. It had a product built like a tool. What it lacked was a symbol, something that could translate steel and discipline into myth, something that could live in the imagination as easily as it lived in the hand. By the late 1930s, Daisy was no longer asking what it believed. It was asking how to give that belief a face. In 1938, Daisy found its symbol. It did not come from an engineering lab or a marketing firm. It came from the pages of the Sunday Funnies, a comic strip called Red Ryder, drawn by artist Fred Harmon, had begun gaining national attention. Harmon was not inventing a Hollywood fantasy. He had grown up on a ranch in Colorado. He knew the West not as a performance, but as work. His cowboy was not a singer or a showman. Red Ryder was competent, quiet, dangerous when necessary. Daisy recognized something familiar in him. They did not want to simply license an image. They did not want a sticker on a box. They wanted a rifle that felt like it had stepped out of that comic strip and into the real world. A gun that looked, sounded, and behaved like something pulled from a saddle scabbard rather than a toy shelf. The result was the Daisy Red Ryder Model 1938. It was, without exaggeration, the most important object Daisy ever made. When a boy opened the box, he was not greeted by plastic or paint. He was handed a rifle that weighed nearly 3 pounds. The barrel and receiver were made of heavy-gauge blued steel. Cold, dense, honest. The stock was not molded or laminated. It was a solid piece of American hardwood, stained a deep walnut brown. The grain was real because the wood was real. Burned directly into that stock was the image of Red Ryder on horseback. Not printed, not glued, branded. A permanent mark, like a ranch symbol pressed into hide. It told the owner that this was not an accessory. It was an heirloom. The defining feature sat beneath the receiver, the lever. To cock the Red Ryder, a boy had to brace the stock against his hip, wrap his fingers around the metal loop, and pull it forward. It required effort. The mechanism responded with a distinctive click-clack, the audible engagement of steel parts under tension. That sound mattered. It announced that the rifle was alive, ready, loaded with potential. Daisy's engineers added details that served no ballistic function but carried enormous symbolic weight. A saddle ring was mounted to the side of the receiver, a real metal ring fitted with a leather thong. It allowed the rifle to be tied to handlebars, hung from a nail in a barn, or imagined slung from a horse. It whispered frontier, not factory.
The ammunition completed the experience. The Red Ryder fired a 177 caliber steel BB, often coated in copper. They came in paper tubes and cardboard cartons. When poured into the loading door, they made a sound like rain hitting a tin roof. In the hand, they were cold and heavy. These were not foam darts. They were metal spheres traveling at roughly 300 feet per second. When fired, the rifle produced a small but unmistakable recoil, a physical confirmation that energy had been released. The BB could be seen in flight for a fraction of a second, a brief golden streak, before striking its target with a sharp ping. Tin cans danced. Fence posts rang. The timing could not have been more precise. As the world darkened and the United States prepared for war, the Daisy factory became a strange mirror of the adult world. Fathers were shipped overseas carrying M1 Garands. Sons stayed home, patrolling backyards and vacant lots with Red Riders. One generation marched toward real battlefields. The other rehearsed, unknowingly, in miniature. Daisy leaned into this alignment. They spoke of marksmanship, not play. They partnered with the Boy Scouts of America, offering merit badges. They published manuals on building backyard shooting ranges. Safety was taught, but it was the safety of the firing line. Discipline, awareness, responsibility, not abstinence. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Red Rider had become a rite of passage. If you had one, you belonged. If you didn't, you waited. The Plymouth factory ran relentlessly, stamping steel, fitting wood to metal, packaging what felt less like a product and more like permission, a permission to step closer to the adult world. In those years, the gap between fathers and sons was narrow. The tools were the same, only scaled down. The danger was real, but managed. And in countless backyards across America, the sharp thwack of a BB striking steel marked a childhood that understood weight, distance, and consequence long before it understood words like war. For nearly 70 years, the factory on Union Street had been the heartbeat of Plymouth, Michigan. Its presence was constant, the rhythmic pounding of stamping presses, the smell of hot oil and steel, the shift whistle that structured daily life. Generations of workers passed through its doors and left pieces of themselves behind. Calloused hands, damaged hearing, a deep familiarity with machines that demanded respect. But by the late 1950s, the rhythm began to falter. The pressures were mounting, and they came from multiple directions at once. The machinery inside the Plymouth plant was old, some of it dating back to the windmill era. It required constant maintenance and skilled hands to keep it alive. At the same time, labor in Michigan had grown expensive. The unions were strong, demanding higher wages and better benefits for the men who stood at the presses and lathes. From the perspective of accountants and executives staring at ledgers, the factory was no longer an asset. It was a liability. The world around Daisy was changing, and the company began looking for distance, from costs, from unions, from the past itself. That distance was found far to the south in a small town in the Ozark Mountains, Rogers, Arkansas. The labor there was cheaper, the land was plentiful, the workers were non-union. On paper, the decision made sense. In 1958, the announcement was made. Daisy was leaving Plymouth. To the town, it felt less like a business decision and more like abandonment. This was not just a factory relocating. It was an institution walking away from the people who had built it. The men who worked those lines were not easily replaceable. They carried tribal knowledge, things you could not write into manuals. They knew how to heat spring steel so it wouldn't snap in winter. They knew how to turn maple stock so the grain resisted cracking. They understood machines by sound and vibration, by instinct earned over decades. None of that could be crated. When the trucks arrived, the process felt like a dismantling of memory. Massive stamping presses were unbolted from concrete floors where they had sat since the 19th century. Tooling, dies, molds, everything that could be moved was loaded up and hauled away. What remained were empty spaces, oil-stained floors, and silence. The men were left behind. They were given severance checks and handshakes and told to find new work in a town whose economic spine had just been removed. Some tried, some left, some stayed and watched the building decay. In Rogers, Arkansas, Daisy reassembled itself in a new, modern facility. It was efficient, clean, designed for volume and speed. But it was not Plymouth. The continuity had been broken. The chain that connected craft to object, worker to product, had snapped. Back in Michigan, the old factory stood hollow. Its windows shattered. Its roof sagged under the weight of winter. The sounds that had defined the town, the presses, the forges, the controlled violence of industry, were gone. What remained was a brick shell slowly rotting at the center of Plymouth, a monument to an era that had ended without ceremony. This was the first break that could not be repaired, not because a factory moved, but because the people who knew how to make Daisy what it was did not move with it. By the time Daisy was fully established in Arkansas, the pressure had shifted. The threat was no longer economic survival or production capacity. It was liability. A new force had entered American manufacturing, and it did not speak the language of steel or craft. It spoke in statistics, eye injuries, lawsuits, risk mitigation. The consumer safety movement was rising, and the BB gun sat squarely in its sights. The mandate was simple and relentless: make it safer. Engineers who had once been tasked with making rifles shoot harder and straighter were now given a different set of priorities. Velocity was dialed back. Springs were weakened. Mechanisms were redesigned to prevent misuse, even at the cost of feel. The rifle still functioned, but something essential was being drained out of it. Then came the decision that changed everything. For decades, the soul of the Red Ryder had lived in its stock. It was wood, solid, American hardwood. It had weight. It absorbed shock. It aged. It scratched and darkened and carried the marks of use. When a boy pressed it against his cheek, he felt something warm and real. That wood was replaced. Management called the new material a durable composite. It was molded plastic, textured with a fake grain pattern meant to imitate what had been discarded. It was lighter, cheaper, easier to produce at scale. And the moment you touched it, you knew the difference. Plastic did not thud, it clacked. Tap it with a fingernail and the sound gave it away, hollow, sharp, insubstantial. Run a hand along its surface, and you felt the residue of the mold, the seam line where two halves had been fused together. A visible scar of mass production. Wood had demanded care, plastic demanded nothing. The change rippled outward. The barrel and receiver, once made from heavy-gauge steel, were thinned. The lever, formerly a solid loop of cast metal, became stamped sheet metal, lighter and prone to wobble. The saddle ring, once functional, became decorative. What had been built to endure now existed only to resemble what it used to be. The rifle still fired, but it no longer spoke. The familiar weight was gone. The resistance in the lever softened. The sound changed. The sharp, authoritative thwack dulled into something quieter, less certain. With the danger engineered out, something else vanished alongside it: respect. A wooden rifle had demanded attention. Mishandle it, and it could break a window, or worse. A plastic rifle felt incapable of consequence. It invited carelessness because it no longer communicated risk. This was not just a downgrade in materials. It was a severing of a relationship. What had once been a tool became a product. What had once required responsibility became disposable. And in the pursuit of safety and profit, Daisy crossed a line it could not uncross. The gun still bore the name, but the weight was gone. The sound was gone, and with them went the quiet understanding that this object mattered.
The end did not arrive with a ban. It arrived with a substitute. By the late 20th century, a new object had begun to colonize the American living room. It came in a gray plastic box, connected to a television, operated from a couch. The home video game console did not demand space, weather, or preparation. It did not require a backyard, a fence post, or a tin can. It required a thumb. The bridge between worlds appeared in the form of Duck Hunt. It looked familiar on the surface: a gun-shaped controller, a target, a trigger. But beneath the resemblance, everything had changed. The rifle was no longer launching a projectile. It was emitting a beam of light. The recoil was gone. The weight was negligible. The feedback came not from steel or wood, but from pixels responding on a glass screen. This was shooting without physics. When a boy fired a Red Ryder, he interacted with gravity, distance, and resistance. The BB dropped. The wind mattered. The angle mattered. Miss the can and the shot ended in a dull thud against a fence or the dirt. Hit it and it danced. Cause and effect were immediate and tangible. The digital gun operated differently. The shot was an instruction. The target was a hitbox. Success or failure was determined by code, not trajectory. There was no reloading ritual, no pause to pour BBs into a loading port, no waiting, no patience. A miss cost nothing. A hit taught nothing beyond timing. The loop had changed. Load, aim, fire became point, click, reset. Consequence was replaced by repetition, risk by simulation. A child could fire thousands of virtual rounds in an hour without ever touching metal, without ever feeling recoil, without ever smelling oil. The appeal was undeniable. It was warm inside. It was fast. It was endless. Daisy tried to follow. The company introduced rifles styled after the weapons-filling game screens, tactical shapes, plastic rails, synthetic finishes. But it was an unwinnable race. Daisy was still selling a tool in a culture that had shifted toward toys. The backyard no longer competed with the television. The garage could not compete with the screen. The BB gun did not vanish. It became irrelevant. What had once been a rite of passage was reduced to an option, a novelty, something bought occasionally, used briefly, and forgotten. The cultural weight that had carried the Red Ryder through generations evaporated, not because it was outlawed, but because it was no longer required. The replacement was complete. The physical act of shooting, of waiting, compensating, committing, had been abstracted into an algorithm. The child no longer learned how force traveled through space. He learned how a system responded to input. Physics had not been challenged. It had been bypassed. Today, the Red Ryder still exists. You can find it hanging in a big box store, sealed inside a plastic blister pack, suspended between fishing lures and camping chairs. The box still carries the cowboy. The name is still there. But when the rifle is lifted from its packaging, the difference is immediate and unmistakable. It is light, too light. The stock is no longer wood. It is the same hollow plastic introduced decades earlier, molded with artificial grain and painted brown in an attempt to imitate what was lost. The metal is thinner now, coated in a black finish that scratches easily. The lever feels gritty, loose. It works, but without conviction. It is a product engineered to meet minimum standards, not to endure. It is designed to be bought, used briefly, and forgotten. The original factory in Plymouth, Michigan, did not survive long enough to witness this version of the gun. After Daisy left in 1958, the massive brick complex on Union Street stood abandoned for decades. Windows shattered, roofs sagged, water pooled on floors where machinists had once stood shoulder to shoulder. The building became a shell, too large to repurpose, too expensive to restore. When demolition crews finally arrived, they did not just remove a safety hazard. They erased the physical birthplace of an idea. The walls that had once contained the roar of drop forges and the hiss of welding torches were reduced to rubble. The dust settled. The lot went quiet. What vanished was not just a factory, it was a philosophy. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company had never intended to shape childhood. It had set out to build machines. But because it was born in iron, it accidentally built a teacher. The original Red Ryder taught a simple, uncomfortable truth. Power exists, and handling it requires restraint. The weight mattered. The resistance mattered. The sound mattered. That sound, the sharp thwack of a BB striking steel, was more than noise. It was feedback, confirmation, a reminder that actions traveled through the real world and landed somewhere. When the weight was removed, the sound softened. When the sound softened, the respect faded. And when the backyard gave way to the screen, the sound disappeared entirely. Nothing replaced it. The empty lot in Plymouth still feels quiet in a way that has nothing to do with wind or weather. There is no echo left to chase, no machinery to imagine, just space where something heavy once stood and mattered. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that absence too, then this is the kind of history we explore here. Stories about objects that shaped people and what happened when they stopped. You can subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. You can like the video. It helps more than you think. And if you have your own memory of a Red Ryder or a sound that defined your childhood, leave it in the comments. Some things are easier to remember when they're shared, and some sounds, once gone, never come back.